Hi there. Um, I've got around about 25 on my list to come this afternoon, but I'm going to get going now anyway because I've only got between 1:30 and 2. Um, Hi Celia, you're there, and I can see that Shumin is there. Hello. So I've got two of you, so that's really supportive. Thank you for joining. Um, I'm going to share my screen and go through what I've got. I am recording, so I think that this may well be available on the university site at somewhere, but just to let you know that. Okay. And hopefully maybe some other people will join and we can have some kind of discussion, questions and so on towards the end. Anyway, I will share my screen again and off we go. So let me just get my screen up. Hopefully you can see this. Okay, right. So I'm going to get going because I did have quite a bit that I wanted to say after I said I would do this teach out and thought about the climate change teaching that I've experienced over the time of being a teacher educator, and what I feel perhaps is the disalignment between the climate emergency and the climate change education that's going on in schools in England at the moment. That's my context, that's my background, so that's really my perspective and where I'm coming from. I think one of the things that I wanted to say at the very start is that just to outline, my background is geography education, so that's where I'm coming from. And I really wanted to clarify that even though throughout this presentation I make various points about the education system and teachers, that I am not coming from this as teachers as deficit. I'm not blaming teachers at all. My perspectives are very much, bigger than that, and the problem is not teachers. So just to quickly go through my plan, I was going to look at some of the ways to make change happen. What are some of the ways that we make social change happen regarding things that are important to us and the world? And also then moving into thinking about climate change education currently, again, from a geography perspective. And then finishing off with some ideas for improving climate change education. Okay, so first up, thinking about some of the ways that we make change happen, and it won't be a surprise to you that that can come from the top down, or it can be bottom up through social movement, people-centered movement and pressure and so on. And I think we've seen a lot of both of those regarding climate change over the last 2 to 3 years, particularly with the social movement and the strikes for climate. So I wanted to use an analogy. I was listening to Noam Chomsky on Monday night, and he was talking at the Oxford Climate Society, and he was coming at climate change through kind of social movement and capitalism, and drew some really interesting analogies between how the civil rights movement kind of progressed and how change was enabled through different forms of legislation and social movement. So I'm just using this as a quick analogy that I'm then going to take forward into climate change education. So obviously, civil rights movement in the US, this is an image of Elizabeth Eckford, who after the Supreme Court ruled an end to segregation in schools, the southern states were still really resisting that. So even though the legislation changed, society in some parts of the US was not seemingly ready for that kind of emancipation and movement. This is Elizabeth going, trying to attend school. She wasn't actually allowed in that day on her first attempt, and you can see some of that social resistance, that local resistance behind her. Eventually, the president at the time, Eisenhower, sent in federal soldiers to allow students into that school. And after, 1958, school integration became widespread. That's just an example of change through power structures. Other change through individual struggle. Here you've got a picture of Rosa Parks, recognized figure, very widely seen as the mother of modern day civil rights, in her individual act of refusing to surrender her seat. And that sparked wide-reaching kind of social reflection on the status quo as it was. That's a very sort of poignant human story. And after that, in 1956, the US Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. So that affected change in that way. Also change through social movement. So just continuing with this civil rights theme, through small scale and large scale social movements. There's an example here on the left of the 4 college students that were refused to be served at the Woolworths counter because it was a segregated lunch counter. They sat in, they refused to move. This developed into a much wider social movement known as the Greensboro sit-ins. And you can see a picture there of one black woman sitting at a lunch counter, being, vilified really, and awful behavior going on behind her. But she was, prepared to sit there and make a stand for what she thought was right and what needed changing. And then obviously can't go through that without talking about Martin Luther King and his influence on that social movement and change. And what came after 1964-65, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. And just to say there about the not without consequence, obvious consequences for MLK, but also for all those individuals, the ones that aren't as well known as, for example, Rosa Parks, that gave up, all sorts of things for what they believed was right. And just then bringing it through to education, and here it is still thinking about civil rights, but just thinking about how change in society comes through education. Professor Lodder Jackson writes about the impact of educators and education in terms of social change. And she talks about activism, including conventional means, so demonstrations, but also unconventional means of affecting change, like discussing social justice in the classroom in particular ways. She says that teachers have always had agency, if they choose to exercise it, to make change in society, and that history reminds teachers that education is a continuous struggle for equality. I think that's important to drag through to the now, and the talking about climate change education that's still relevant. And she mentions about quiet acts towards change executed by educators, and gives examples of how teachers did that in the 50s and 60s. And I'll just go on to thinking about climate change in terms of the education and what current teachers are able to do, and looking at the current climate curriculum perspective alongside wider public perspectives on climate action. So here, having a look at the AQA GCSE spec that's currently in use in England widely. There are 16 units to study in this GCSE, and climate change is one of them. That's approximately 6% of the GCSE, and on average, if you've got 150 study hours across 2 years, that obviously may vary. Then climate change would equate to 9 hours of study across the GCSE. And then on the other side here, you've got the People's Climate Vote, which the results of which were published in January this year. And that was sorted by the United Nations Development Programme. It's the largest survey of public opinion to date on people's perspectives on climate change, with 1.2 million people responding from 50 countries around the world. And from this report, you can see that 72% of people that replied from Western Europe and North America said that climate change was a global emergency. And there are other percentages there from different parts of the world. Another interesting one here is that of all respondents, nearly 70% of under 18s across those different regions said that climate change is a global emergency. And that was compared to 58% of those aged 60 or over. And of all the people that said climate change is a global emergency, 59% of them said that the world should be doing everything necessary and urgently in response. And I was just equating that to this geography GCSE that 14 to 16-year-olds are studying, and the balance there in terms of, is that proportionate, and does that really constitute a necessary and urgent response through a subject that is intrinsically linked with studies of climate and thinking about global issues. Okay, so just going on to looking at that GCSE specification in a bit more detail. Here you've got the again AQA section on climate change from the GCSE, and having a look at that specification content, having a look at the first key idea. You've got natural factors, you've got human factors outlined, and what really does that content say to you in terms of balance? And what might it say to a geography teacher with a very human geography background, for example, and one that hasn't specialized in perhaps climate geography? So coming at that as a relative novice, it may well suggest that the natural factors and human factors are taken to be balanced, potentially with equal time and emphasis given to both, potentially. And then going on to having a look at the management of climate change in this GCSE specification, to what extent is the human response considered? To what extent is human and societal change covered? The balance of human change and technological solution, I think, is quite clear from this specification, that there are technological solutions and ways to manage climate change, possibly a quick fix we are looking to develop. And it certainly does not suggest that ecological oneness is to be part of the study. And that just takes me on to a model produced recently by Kerry Facer, Professor of Climate Change Leadership, where she's produced this model here, looking at different levels of climate change and focusing on the foundational narrative level here, where there is a consideration about ecological oneness. And geography education really does not, in my view, promote the study of ecological justice or ecological oneness. The relationship with the planet, is about interaction and interdependence, but not about intrinsically bound existence. And I question why that might be, and thinking about that could lead to uncomfortable, perhaps unpopular ground, unpopular places in the classroom in discussions, challenging the concepts of more, of growth, of continual use and materialism. And Henderson, in his paper on looking at the foundations of teaching climate change, posits that teachers avoid the value-laden concepts of climate change because of this reason. It might take teachers into uncomfortable places that challenge current values. This is just thinking about the positions, the approaches that teachers can take in teaching climate change. And teachers left with very little room for manoeuvre on content as directed by specifications and assessments in terminal exams. They haven't got that much wiggle room there, but what they do have to very much choose individually is their own approach, their own positionality in terms of their teaching and their teaching strategy. So that may come consciously or it may come unconsciously, but they will be selecting resources, asking or not asking certain questions, for example, foregrounding particular students' views, and taking the 2 content points from the GCSE specification, in the natural versus human causes or anthropogenic causes of climate change, thinking about what the balance is there, and the positionality of the teacher is really important there. Choosing an approach, and there are 4 suggested approaches on this slide, has really profound impacts on student takeaways, what they take away from lessons and their understanding. Okay, let's move on to considerations for improving climate change education, and how education could play a better and bigger role in responding to climate change. Miller and Charlesworth suggest that education practices should be heart, head and hand rather than simply head. More effective, this would be a more effective approach to achieve changes in behaviour, if that's what we're looking for as an output, as an outcome for climate change education. And heart, head and hand, examples of this might be local community-based projects that get students involved in things that are happening locally, researching, investigating and coming up with solutions. It could also be that with very restrictive content-heavy curricula, that extracurricular activity that offers engagement and opportunities for a wide, diverse student population could be really important and led through schools. Also, the nature of climate change and the solutions that we are needing to work towards are very interdisciplinary in their nature. And so that could be modelled and shown through schools and through academic study much more potentially. Thinking about invigorating the civic role of schools, and with that students, as they are starting to do from 2019 onwards, students demanding something of schools, of management, to operate responsibly as organisations and to practice what they preach in terms of their civic role in the communities. And going on from there, just thinking about David Hicks, who's a big writer in geography education on climate change in particular, he suggests that a more holistic approach of knowing, feeling, choosing and acting is a way forward, and a much more balanced approach to climate change education. And here are some of the questions that he poses as suggested things to look at in a geography of hope, as he calls it. So, in my experience over the last 2 decades of geography education, teaching myself, supporting students in mentoring, in becoming teachers, and also working in higher education around geography education, supporting beginning teachers, I think these feeling, choosing and acting areas are very much sideline and superficial in terms of the amount of time spent on them. It's very heavily based on the knowing, which of course is important, has an important part to play. Going back to the GCSE specification, and thinking about that head, heart and hands idea, is there a balance on that? Does this specification, it's only one specification for GCSE, but does this example require heart, head and hands work? Rhetorical question, but my answer would be no. It's not emphasizing heart and hands approach in any way. And to what extent would the managing climate change content of the GCSE, mitigation, adaptation, to what extent does that allow for knowing, feeling, choosing and acting? I think just to go on in terms of thinking about ways to improve climate change education, questioning what knowledge of climate change teachers have, and there's research that shows teachers self reporting lack the necessary content knowledge, and there's more on that. The references that I put there, they're at the end on the slides, but also there's a question about where they're getting their knowledge for teaching from. And Noble has carried out work on the digital age in terms of where teachers are getting their information from, and also thinking about information going from the public sphere into private control. There is really a big question over the quality of information available, but also the public's ability, and in that we're including teachers, educators, the ability to sift and use it, and to think critically about these sources of information, and the evidence that's being taken forward and used in classrooms. And there's a recent review, Steve Puttick's done some work on the sources of information that teachers are using for their climate change teaching, and the main sources that are used: the internet, government sources, mass media, professional development courses. So I'd say that there is arguably a really strong need for a much greater look at developing quality, evidence-based knowledge sources for climate change education specifically. The UN, they have a climate change teacher award, and they are looking sort of to empower teachers and students to better understand the issues, and they do have education courses for teachers, climate change accreditation. So that's one example of possible ways forward, and opening out our current thinking. So here, thinking about Boaventura de Sousa Santos says about we have epistemological monocultures, and the way that we look at climate change from different knowledge bases and worldviews, it is very limited. So we are teaching climate change from a very Western cultural view. And it's saying here that no single type of knowledge can account for all, and so is incomplete in different ways. And are we able to challenge the current educational paradigm? Is there space for this? Can we as teachers do that? And I think all bound up in that is the knowledge-based, content-heavy curriculum that teachers talk about, the emphasis on terminal exams, the current DFE guidance that came out in September 2020 on the fact that we're not allowed as teachers to use material with publicly stated or from organizations that state that they are against capitalism. So one example that I'm using, that I use in geography education is materials, resources from John Huckle and his publications, and on his website, which is very popular among geography teachers, he states there's a focus on students and teachers' unhappiness, their alienation, and the potential of radical democracy and post-capitalism to offer them hope. And so my question is, are we therefore not supposed to be using that particular source of information? I think this links to the sort of the earlier points that I made in this presentation about teachers lacking content knowledge, potentially avoiding difficult content related to values, capitalism, materialism, our current way of life. And here Klein reminds us how important this all is in tackling climate change. Neoliberal ideology related to those previous points, a key barrier to tackling climate change in general. The relentless pursuit of growth has locked us into a system that is incompatible with a stable climate, Klein says. And so, teachers not, as I said earlier at the very start, I don't want to put teachers in as a deficit, in a deficit model here, but the teachers I've worked with, saying the teachers I have worked with pretty much all do and did want to make a difference. They come into teaching geography wanting to make a difference and empower students, but that actually they are very much constrained by my metaphor here of being in between a rock and a hard place. They have a curriculum to follow, it's content heavy, they want to do the best by their students want to get good exam results, the system is outcome driven, and so that's on the one side. And also restricting what teachers can do is government direction for education. Teachers arguably as technicians currently and working within a neoliberal capitalist ideology, which seems not able to be challenged. Last point really I've got here, my last point is about teachers as intellectuals. And I was reading an article by Giraud from 1985, and it just made me think it was so relevant, even more so now than when it was written in 1985, potentially, that it is imperative to not only view teachers as intellectuals, but also thinking about the social functions that teachers perform, and that they are curriculum makers, and they need agency and autonomy to continue to consider the values of education and how best to deliver it in their contexts. And I haven't got time to read that quote, but if you read that rather longer quote there from Giraud's paper, I just think it's really poignant in terms of climate change education right now and what teachers are able to do, perhaps what they need to be able to do. I will finish there because it is 2 o'clock. So thank you very much for joining me. And I'm just going to, I have got my video on, that's okay. I'll stop there. Please feel free to leave if you need to. If you've got any questions, do come in. Thanks everybody. I've got to go for 2 o'clock, something I've got at 2 o'clock as well. So Thanks for joining me and take care.